In this talk, we're going to explore digital solutions in sepsis. And in particular, we're going to look at what tools exist that could help clinicians diagnose sepsis early or even predict sepsis, but also prognosticate sepsis, identify subgroups or subphenotypes of patients with sepsis, and finally, optimally manage patients with sepsis. We'll see that most of those solutions actually involve some kind of machine learning or artificial intelligence solution. So essentially, this is a talk about AI solutions in sepsis. Here are my topics of interest. The learning objectives of this presentation are threefold. First, we'll look at what digital solution could help clinicians recognize and manage patients with sepsis. Second, we'll explore what is the current state of things at the front line in hospitals for these tools. And finally, we'll discuss what challenges actually hinder their development and deployment. Sepsis is a global healthcare burden. It affects up to 50 million cases of patients in the world every year. We know it's the main cause of mortality in the hospital, the main cause of mortality in the intensive care unit. And it's also been reported to be the most expensive condition treated in hospitals. The treatment of sepsis can be simplified as a fourfold problem. First, clinicians need to identify sepsis quickly. Second, they need to control the source of infection as early as possible. Third, they need to correct hypovolemia and vasoplasia. And fourth, they need to treat sepsis-induced organ dysfunctions. And basically, we'll see that most of these problems have existing solutions in the field of digital tools. The layout of this talk is as follows. We'll start with the hype, what exciting applications exist in the field of AI applied to sepsis. Then we'll look at the reality of what is actually available to clinicians, and that will allow us to discuss what is the path to clinical impact. Let's start with the hype. So let's imagine for a second that we had an AI available in the hospital that could help us with a large number of tasks associated with sepsis care. For example, could we predict sepsis even before it starts? Could we prognosticate patients once they develop sepsis? Could AI help us phenotype those patients? Could AI help us control the source of infection using a variety of tasks? Could AI help us with the hemodynamic support of those patients? For example, by predicting hypotension before it starts, or by suggesting an optimal course of fluids and vasopressors. And finally, could AI assist us with a number of other tasks related to organ function? For example, predicting AKI, or helping us with the settings on the ventilator or with dosing of various drugs? Well, the answer is that there actually are published proposals of proof of concepts for most of these applications and even more. All these applications rely on some form of machine learning, which are computerized tools that simply extract knowledge from data. There are three big pillars in machine learning: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. And we're going to define all of those one by one. Supervised learning is the bulk of the literature. More than 90%, I would say, of the literature is actually supervised learning. And here, what we want to do is to learn the mathematical mapping between some input data, so usually patient data, patient characteristics, and some output of interest, for example, mortality or sepsis or length of stay. If the output is binary or categorical, we're doing a classification task. If the output is continuous, then it's a regression task. Next, we have unsupervised learning, and here the goal is to learn the structure in a data set without needing labels. So the most common application is in the field of clustering, but we can also use unsupervised learning to do dimensionality reduction to reduce a data set so it can be projected on 2 or 3 dimensions. And finally, we have reinforcement learning, which is quite different. Here, the objective is to model a decision strategy and to find what decisions optimize some kind of predefined reward. Starting with supervised learning. So here's a typical example of a supervised learning problem applied to sepsis prediction. Here, the team developed a score called the AI Sepsis Expert, and you see here in purple the first subplot. The score goes up and crosses a threshold something like 12 hours before the patient is actually labeled as having sepsis. We could imagine that deploying this in the clinical setting could lead to faster recognition and potentially improved outcomes. This is one of the first large-scale prospective deployment of an AI-based sepsis prediction model. In this paper, they deployed such a machine learning system in 5 hospitals, and it monitored nearly 600,000 patients. You see that nearly 7,000 patients received an alert, so the system alerted and suggested that the patients were about to develop sepsis. And then they split those patients into 2 groups, depending on whether or not the alert was confirmed by a healthcare professional. So it's not a randomized study. However, they did demonstrate that in this group, the outcomes were better. Namely, the mortality was lower, the SOFA progression was less, and the length of stay was also shorter. Moving on to supervised learning. This is probably the hallmark of the papers applying unsupervised learning to patients with sepsis. In this work, they deployed a clustering algorithm to over 60,000 patients, and they identified 4 groups, 4 phenotypes with a different profile of organ failure and different outcomes. We discussed in this piece how such subphenotyping work could lead to new tools to basically include patients in clinical trials in the future. And here the idea is to identify through phenotyping and unsupervised learning a subgroup of patients that is more likely to benefit from an intervention, and to decide to include those patients more selectively into the trials. Next, we'll move on to reinforcement learning. Here, the objective is quite different. We analyze the interactions between an agent and the environment of a patient, the health state of a patient. The agent is the clinician acting on patients. Patients respond by transitioning into a new health state. And if that new health state has more desirable properties, such as a lower risk of death, for example, then a reward is released to the agent and the action is reinforced. That's why it's called reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning and deep reinforcement learning really came into light after this 2015 paper by a team at DeepMind, where they demonstrated for the first time that they were able to train an AI agent to play most Atari games at a superhuman level without explicitly giving any indication about the rules of the games to the AI agent. Since then, reinforcement learning has been applied to a variety of tasks in healthcare and in the ICU. This is a review of such publications. And you see that reinforcement learning works for decisions that are sequential in nature and that are stochastic, so in an environment that is partially random. And in this situation, RL is capable of optimizing a decision process and suggesting an optimal course of action. In my research, we apply reinforcement learning to the never-ending question of hypovolemia and vasoplasia in patients with sepsis, and how can we best correct it. We know that there's a sweet spot where tissue perfusion is optimal, but that being under or above that sweet spot leads to increased risk of organ failure and death. And to some extent, the recent Classic and Clover's trials did not answer that question. That led us to proof of concept in 2018. We demonstrated for the first time that we could indeed deploy RL algorithms to the sequential decision problem of sepsis resuscitation, and that we could train an agent that would eventually converge and suggest an optimal course of action that would potentially directly improve 90-day survival. Since then, the work has been replicated by a large number of teams throughout the world, independently from us, and it also has led to other teams proposing new RL models derived from our initial publication, using a variety of different types of reinforcement learning frameworks. But so far, there's been no prospective validation of this work. So this leads us to the second part of that talk, which is about exploring the reality of, among all of those AI applications that I've presented to you, which ones are actually available to the clinician at the bedside, in the ICU. This is a very striking figure, very well presented, where the researchers looked at the level of readiness of AI application in the ICU. So they surveyed nearly 500 papers, and on the y-axis you see the level of readiness, on the x-axis the time, and what we see very clearly is that the movement is that it's horizontal. Most of the published models are still at the level of model prototyping, early model development, and there is very little happening downwards towards prospective validation, towards deployment at the bedside, towards randomized trials, towards medical device development. Today, if you go to Google Scholar or PubMed and you type early prediction of sepsis or sepsis detection, you're going to get tens of thousands of hits. But how many of those are actually available to clinicians at the bedside? There is a literature review on ML for the prediction of sepsis. What they found back in 2020 was 28 papers summing 150 models. Of those 28 papers, there were only 3 prospective trials and only 1 randomized trial. The randomized trial is this one, 2017, well designed, positive in the sense that there was an improvement in patient outcomes with the machine learning system. The problem is that this is a monocentric trial, and that altogether has 142 patients. We already talked about that Nature Medicine paper of prospective evaluation of a machine learning model, which wasn't published at the time of the review. No affiliation with this particular company, but to my knowledge, this is the only product available if you wanted today to buy a machine learning based sepsis prediction tool. So on one side, we have tens of thousands of publications on PubMed, and on the other side, very, very few randomized trials and very, very few validated tools that are FDA certified. If we take a step back and try to understand what process is required before those tools can be developed, deployed, validated at scale, it appears to be a 3-step process. First, we need to have data available, data in the right quantity and quality. And I would say that in many places this has been sorted. Deploying the models, the machine learning models, is usually the easy part in that process. And I would say that where the difficulties arise is with the deployment at the bedside. And there are a number of reasons why this is the case, but it certainly is very challenging due to legal, ethical issues, human factors aspects, how do you conduct trials of machine learning, and so on. We're going to look at some of those factors. There's a large amount of literature actually in the theory behind the acceptance of new technology. And this is just one of those models, but the technology acceptance models tells you that if you want to improve maximize the use of a new system, you need to maximize the behavioral intention to use. And that this depends on perceived usefulness and the perceived ease of use. So this sounds very straightforward. I think what this model is missing is that sometimes there is a wide gap between the intended effect and the measured effect on our patients. And I'm going to show you a striking example. This paper is not about sepsis, it's about AKI, but it's absolutely fascinating. What they did, they randomized over 6,000 patients into two groups. In the intervention group, the clinicians would see a pop-up window appear in the electronic health record software if the patient was to develop an AKI. And you see that the alert would say, your patient has been identified as having AKI. Here are the numbers, and there's a link to an order set where you can order more investigations and treatments. The results are here. They analyzed progression of AKI, progression to dialysis, and death, splitting patients into teaching and non-teaching hospitals. What we see is that there is no difference in any of the outcomes in the teaching hospitals. In the non-teaching hospitals, the mortality of patients nearly doubled. So obviously this is discussed at length in the paper, and the conclusion from the authors is not satisfying in the sense that they acknowledge that they don't really understand what happened. And I think this is a very important red flag in my mind about the potential gap between a very well-intended digital solution and sometimes an effect on patient and patient care that cannot be predicted. So we have to be extremely careful when we deploy those tools and process in a very stepwise fashion. So to conclude, machine learning and digital solutions in sepsis and in intensive care in general are certainly very exciting, but I would say that they are only a small piece of a very complicated puzzle if we ever want to impact patients positively at scale, and there are many other factors to consider. For example, the clinical relevance is obviously crucial. How do we go about conducting prospective trials and clinical trials of AI? What about human factors and all these aspects of implementation science? There are a number of technical challenges when trying to do this. Think about data interoperability. Think about data quality. Think about generalizability. If you train a model in the US, how do you know it's going to work in India or China? What about interpretability? Many of those models still behave as black box. Then there are a number of aspects around data protection, getting the trust of patients and members of the public, aspects of inclusion and fairness. We talk a lot about model bias. Obviously, we need to have members of the public and patients on board in those projects. And then finally, there are a number of aspects around how do we go about developing a medical device? How do we conduct the safety assurance? How do we protect IP? How do we work with regulators, conducting cost effectiveness analysis, and so on? So, with this in mind, I think it does become very clear that machine learning is certainly important, but it's a much more complicated problem than that. However, I would argue that there might be hope if, for example, we compare the process of developing drugs by pharmaceutical companies to the process of developing those new AI tools. In the pharma company world, they start with thousands, tens of thousands of drug candidates, and then they screen those drugs, those molecules. They conduct preclinical testing, clinical trials, review by regulatory agencies, and then in the end, they only have a few molecules available for use in the clinical setting. And maybe the same thing is happening with those new digital solutions, and it's just a matter of time before those tools reach market. Thank you for watching. I hope that was interesting. Here are my contact details, and don't hesitate to reach out.